not so far away from our monastery was the place where she lived, the room where she slept, on the ground, a little cell or alcove, which she was allowed to use by the family, and therefore the place where she was quite content in her comfort zone. But Catherine was directly called out of that solitude by Jesus, her hidden spouse. But she did have hesitations because she was happy in solitude, and he warned her that by asking her to come out of her solitude, he was not asking her to separate herself from him, but to carry him with her. And he gave her the doctrine, the intuition of the cell, the interior cell, which was her future enclosure. She was not to leak, and therefore she was a contemplative in action. She had all the gifts, and she was quite amazing. She was quite pretty when she was young, and her parents wanted to marry her. She made it very difficult for them by cutting her long hair and showing that she was not the least bit interested. So they had to back down. She could have entered an enclosure, a monastery of nuns, but she entered the mantellate, which were sort of tertiary Dominicans, but they had this mantella, this habit. And that was important because she was able to do a lot while still being entirely a contemplative and a big one. As I say, with the stigmata, and we know the point that they received. So, things started to happen. She was asked by the Lord to bring the Pope, no less, back from Avignon in the south of France to Rome. So off she went with herself, and with insistence she found her way to the presence of the Supreme Pontiff, who was taken aback. But he sat up when he heard a few things, one of which was, the old Italian used was qui puzza, here it stinks. Oh. And then she told him something that only the Lord knew about his early life. And so he calmed down considerably and started to listen to what this young lassie had to say, because she couldn't have known this without divine knowledge. So, fragile though this woman was, she had her way, and the Pope came back to Rome. She, of course, having had that contact, became known, and her influence was huge. And when she would go around, she would need quite a few priests to be available, because rather like Eddie Stone here in Ireland, they had to have priests to mop up the operation of what Eddie had to say. Knowledge, teaching. And so these would be going on wherever she went, and one of the bases that she had was our monastery of Sant'Antimo, not far from Siena. She was there. But then things started to happen. She was given a very strong devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, so much so that she had a special dispensation to receive frequently, and that meant going to confession frequently. One time she was in Siena and had a great desire to receive the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Her spiritual father, who was now Blessed Raymond of Capua, who became head of the order, the Dominican order, eventually, that day had no inclination at all to celebrate, because in those days people didn't used to celebrate every day. But he felt out of nowhere a pull. So he went along with it and said Mass on a quiet altar in the Dominican complex. He was at the moment where before Holy Communion he had to break the host, the large host, into two. That was okay. But then, as you know, he has to break it again, and a small particle goes into the chalice. But what happened at that point knocked him for six. It split of its own accord into a fourth particle, and this jumped, but where? And so he rummaged around as discreetly as he could, all over the altar, behind it and everywhere and on the floor, trying to find this consecrated particle, and couldn't. And so he was distraught. And at the end of the celebration, he went as quickly as he could to tell his superior what had happened. As he was going, he happened to come across another superior going in the other direction. It was the prior of the Carthusians of Siena. And they were glad to see each other, and the Carthusian prior said to him, "Ah, just the man I want. You have access to Catherine. I have a problem and I want to get some light on the matter from your protégé. Take me to her." And so it was. And so the prior said whatever he had in his heart to Catherine and went away happy with himself. Then Raymond of Capua came in and detected that she had a twinkle in her eye and said this, "Have you got anything to do with this?" And with that same twinkle in her eye she said, "Not I, the Lord." "Oh, tell me more." "You look in vain for that particle, Father." "Oh, tell me, where is it? What happened?" "Well, it's like this. The Lord brought himself to me and put it on your heart to celebrate that day so that I could receive. And so that particle was carried by angels to me. And I was in another part of the complex and you didn't know it. So that was the way they would play games with each other. And indeed, even though he was older than she was, he would call her Mama. And so would all her protégés. She had a whole family of those who followed her, and they all called her Mama. She was warm. Indeed, on one occasion, she was not going to let a person lose his soul. It was a criminal. But all one had to do to qualify as a criminal in those days was say something. And it said something about the Republic, and they weren't amused, and he was in prison and going to be guillotined. So he was thoroughly cheesed off with God and man, and he was going to a bad place. And Catherine knew it. But she was not going to let it happen. So she went and looked for him in his cell, in death row. And remember now, she was a young lassie. And he woke up. "Oh, what's going on here?" And she got through to him initially through her humanity. And we have some of the correspondence between them. And wow, it's interesting, because one can see what is happening. She knew full well what was going on, but she allowed that to happen so as at least to soften his heart. And just before the execution, we have this letter from his pen. "If you are there, it will be as though going to a great banquet." In other words, he was happy as long as she was there when the execution took place. And so it was. She kept her promise, and she collected the chopped head. But his soul went on, because she got him to pray before. She was a strong woman. And do you know, it didn't stop after her death at the age of 33 in Rome, where she's buried, although her head came back to Siena afterwards. Because after her death, she would still do good, e.g., woman in distress, not able to make ends meet. Catherine appeared and worked for her, and things would happen. That has happened also with Thérèse of Lisieux, that kind of intervention. Amazing things going on. The great saints have great powers, which brings me to where I want to finish. Also, the great devils have great powers. I want to be aware of it. All those stories are the good side, the bright side, the joyful side, the side that children are peaceful with. But watch out, because old Nick also is happy to be hidden. And his great trick is to make us not think that he's serious, a great myth. But you look now at what children are watching, and it's not the Walt Disney of old. You look at the odd vampire coming in. You look at the way that the ugly is made to be the normal. Well, it's all around, and it's not just human, it's demonic. So you be careful, you mothers and grandmothers and children, what you look at and allow to look at, because we are responsible for our soul, and the portal of the soul is the eye. What goes in stays in. There was a young lassie a few years ago who was given a strange experience in Korea. She was an artist, and she was given an experience of the beyond. She was given a guided tour of the beyond, and she was asked when she came back, paint it. And she was a brilliant painter, and she did. So we have what she saw, scenes. And essentially it boils down to this. This sin, this habit, leads to this. And it was exactly the opposite in the beyond. And one interesting one was how through smoking things come into the soul. It's not just a substance or a dependency, but it's also something that somehow opens the soul to other things. Another one was television itself, that there were demons coming out of bad television and lodging themselves inside the soul without their knowing it. Now we have also the other stuff, what's coming out of internet, which is, although neutral and very useful, weighed by its bad use towards the dark. You look at what pops up in the margin. And if you only knew the proportion of men, respectable men in particular, who spend hours in the dark night in the privacy of their room gazing at you know what, even when they're married. Is that light? So just be aware, we need a strong immune system, and that is made by grace. There's no shortcut. As we have in the reading, anyone who thinks he's without sin, as we would say today, is kidding himself. Unfortunately, we priests know it. Often at Eastertide we have this experience. The only good confessions we have are those who go regularly. Those who haven't been a long time haven't a thing to confess quite often. So, I would say, take Our Lady's advice seriously at Medjugorje. We need a monthly confession. And do you know that she asked that the young people go every week? Do you know why? It's because they're more exposed to sin and occasions of sin than those of us who are past it. But we're not past it, my friends. We're very much the target of Old Nick. So wake up. Let's get to the good side.